Thanks everyone for coming, and just want to welcome you to a critical conversation put on through the New Polis. And today's critical conversation is on the subjectivities since the 60s. So subjectivities in the plural, the 60s also in the plural. Today we're joined by Dr. Roger Green and Dr. Carl Raschke. And so the topics today are going to span from psychedelics to individualism to political neoliberalism. Maybe someone will bring up Levinas at some point. Maybe someone will talk about phenomenology. There's no telling what's going to happen with this group of people and these two presenters. So thank you, Roger, and thank you, Carl, for joining us and for helping put this workshop on. So our first speaker today is Roger Green, and Roger is a lecturer in English at Metropolitan State University of Denver. He's the general editor of the New Polis and author of a book titled A Transatlantic Political Theology of Psychedelic Aesthetics, with an E. He's going to be speaking today first with us. So Roger, you're welcome to begin, and maybe read the title of your paper for those of us who have not seen it yet.
Before we get going, Jason, could you introduce yourself?
That's a good idea. Right, yeah, I'm Jason Alvis. I'm the moderator for today. I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Vienna in philosophy department, and I run a research project called Revenge of the Sacred, Phenomenology and the End of Christianity in Europe. And yeah, I work on topics like phenomenology, political theology, violence studies, these sorts of things. So the topic today is actually quite interesting for me, and I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
All right.
Roger?
Okay, thanks. The book is actually aesthetics with an A, E, but I think it might be misspelled in the email. And the paper title I'm giving for this talk is just Why the 60s. And it's mostly an extraction from the book, but it's been adapted a little bit for this context. It's going to take me right at 25 minutes to read this opening section. And I'm basically doing this with the intention of setting up a lot of the stuff that Carl is going to talk about in his portion of the talk. So thanks for being here and listening and contributing. I want to hear your thoughts too. But I want to begin today's talk by asserting this central kind of thesis that what we in the West commonly call psychedelia, including the perspective that psychedelics and other psychoactive substances are agents to liberate consciousness, ought to be reread as a kind of code in cultural poetics for the emergence of what we now call neoliberalism. So furthermore, this rereading ought to be a counter to common political mythologies of the 60s in the US, which on the right see it as a moment of cultural decline and the left see it as a moment of cultural progress. Common historical accounts of the 1960s narrate the decade itself as a kind of trip. In these accounts, the open possibilities articulated at the end of the 1950s in the United States end with violence and destruction, a breaking down of national identity center, as well as the dispersing activist movements into different factions that cease to communicate with each other. The end of the decade is often characterized as the political inefficacy of progressive movements, government scandals, murderous cults, and the loss of some sort of moral fabric, while some will claim that the magical time in San Francisco ended well before the decade's end with the diggers' public funeral of Hippie, Son of Man, in 1967, the performative nature of the funeral expresses what I have termed psychedelic aesthetics, in the sense that they are both self-aware of their own attention to their own construction, and that they are self-aware in relation to the sacrificial overtones of death and rebirth. No matter the narrative's location for nostalgia, for many, the chaos of the 1960s returns to order, even if it's a morally corrupt one, such as law and order politics. And most children eventually grow up. This is kind of one of the ways the narratives goes. Hippies turn to yippies, turn to yuppies. Yes, another narrative often superimposed onto the 1960s in the United States is one of growing up, of coming of age, of losing innocence, of graduating from acid tests. More microcosmically, Woodstock became Altamont. But it is important to know that just as groups like the San Francisco Diggers certainly did, that the construction of the supreme fiction of the 1960s as an exceptional era was present in criticism before the decade even happened. At the end of the 1950s, across discursive media, people seemed to be looking for something new. In 1960, Arthur Schlesinger characterized the rise of the Beat generation as the result of the failure of our present society to provide ideals capable of inspiring the youth of our nation. In the same year, Paul Goodman writes in Growing Absurd that culture is, first of all, city and patriotic culture. He argues, quote, I shall try to show that patriotism is the culture of childhood and adolescence. Without this first culture, we come with fatal emptiness to the humane center of science, art, humanity, and God. Certain people aspire mightily to appearances on television and other kinds of notoriety, but I doubt that many now think of being honored by a statue in the park and winning immortal fame, the fame of big culture, end quote. So this generation gap was being written into public dialogue. The youth were central, but the current youth were seen as disaffected. C. Wright Mills used the term postmodern in 1963 to characterize an age where the ideals of freedom and reason have become moot, where increased rationality may not be assumed to make for increased freedom. This was a collapse of the Eurocentric Enlightenment thought. There are reverberations of what Reisman articulated in The Lonely Crowd and what Herbert Marcuse would articulate shortly in One-Dimensional Man. The irony of the late 1950s, according to cultural historian Larry May in Recasting America, was that although the United States had actually achieved its utopian dreams expressed earlier in the century, the effect was to bring about a state of extreme anxiety in the US population. So while the perception of living in crisis was not new, their concern, particularly in its intensity, was new. It is rare for people, says Larry May, to be so self-aware, so self-conscious, so self-concerned. According to May, one of the main reversals in the feeling of relief at America's newfound power was in mass participation in government. Mediated culture had created the youth as an identity category to be marketed to, and this itself produced a kind of culture. So Schlesinger presently also claimed that national purpose acquires meaning as part of an ongoing process. Its certification lies not in rhetoric, but in performance. We can see this even in jaded reactions to the 60s. So in 1971, John Lennon expressed his jadedness surrounding the period by reflecting that nothing happened, we all dressed up, the same bastards are in control, the same people are running everything, it's exactly the same. For Lennon, in his freshly post-Beatles bitterness, the performance of the 1960s was not effective, it was all a show. And such bitter perspectives are just as present as nostalgia for a time when everyone had a cause, for a time when the personal became political, when the fabrication between public and private made the public game of lifestyle itself a game, or like made lifestyle a game. The fact that the personal could become political is merely an articulation of expanded citizenship, a collapse between ontogenetic and phylogenetic expressed by psychedelic aesthetics as a deterritorialized utopic desire for the death of the death drive. You can ask me questions about that if you want. Mediated culture also challenged longstanding notions about subjectivity, perhaps especially the idea that subjectivity is a trap. In 1958, Hannah Arendt described with dismay the reactions people exhibited at the success of Russia's Sputnik satellite. In her prologue to The Human Condition, she says, when humans looked up from the earth toward the skies, they could behold there a thing of their own making. The immediate reaction expressed on the spur of the moment was relief about the first step towards escape from man's imprisonment to earth. When we see in Arendt's words that just before the psychedelic movement took off, there was a culturally expressed desire for something outside, something more expansive in terms of situating subjectivity. It's also true that the youth of the affluent societies were growing up having their lives documented and directed in ways previously unknown to humans. This may be because the youth of affluent societies were growing up less as subjects than previous generations. And I mean that in the sense that the standard of living afforded a great deal of expendable income for the youth. So at the same time, mediated culture located youth itself as a subject. The cult of childhood itself was produced both through themes of a return to childhood and a critique of masculinity. The first of these themes, the critique of childhood, can be seen in a few important books before the introduction of psychedelics to the public. In the electric Kool-Aid acid test, which was not written before they were introduced to the public, Tom Wolfe mentions the importance of both Hermann Hesse and Arthur C. Clarke. Wolfe compares Ken Kesey to Leo from Hermann Hesse's Journey to the East. He was never saying, quote, he was never openly known as the leader. Like Kesey, he was a non-navigator of the brotherhood. Earlier in his narrative, Wolfe explains that for a long time he couldn't understand the one oriental practice the pranksters liked, the throwing of the I Ching coins. Eventually, the divinatory practice leads Wolfe to understand Jung's concept of synchronicity, wherein the way the coins fall is inevitably tied up with the entire quality of the moment in which they fall. The kairotic synchronicity of now invokes the ancient past and ushers in the space of the perennial as if it's the basileia itself. It is then that Wolfe has another aha moment, and he says, quote, there's another book on the shelf in Kesey's living room that everybody seems to look at, a little book called Journey to the East by Hermann Hesse. Hesse wrote it in 1932, and yet the sink, it's a book about exactly the pranksters and the Great Bus Trip of 1964. Another book of Hesse's perhaps is more ideologically prefiguring of the psychedelic aesthetics at work here, and that is The Glass Bead Game. Hesse, who was a pacifist, produced, like Aldous Huxley, a politics that may seem overtly naive and even complacently dangerous on the surface in its appeal to pacifism. It was critiqued as kind of quietism. Nevertheless, the Glass Bead Game centralizes themes of childhood and transcendence of a time that are important to psychedelic aesthetics. In the book, Joseph Knecht, an aging scholar, decides to leave the distinguished position as Magister Ludi of the Glass Bead Game in a time set in the future in an academically religious land called Castalia, which is the name that Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert used for one of their foundations after leaving Harvard in the 1960s. The Glass Bead Game is, among other things, academic precision par excellence, and Knecht has completely mastered it. Open to the criticism of a few longtime friends, however, he comes to see that Castalia is intellectually overprivileged and thus out of touch with humanity of the rest of the world. According to Knecht's friend, an aged Catholic priest named Father Jacobus, what Castalia is particularly out of touch with is a deeply critical account of history. In Knecht's resignation letter as Magister Ludi, he cites the words of his friend in the following postscript, quote, times of terror and deepest misery may be in the offing, but if any happiness at all is to be extracted from that misery, it can only be a spiritual happiness, looking backwards towards the conservation of the culture of earlier times, looking forward toward the serene and stalwart defense of things of the spirit in an age which otherwise might succumb wholly to material things. Spirit and history are intertwined for Father Jacobus and Knecht. So though an old man, Knecht leaves Castalia for more secular territory in order to become a tutor to his friend Plinio's son Tito at a remote house in the mountains. Here, it's his mission as he goes out into the secular world. He seeks to re-enchant the world with a religious conception of the temporal. It is a deepening of Knecht's own spiritualism. On the first morning of his arrival at the family's vacation home in the mountains, Knecht finds Tito dancing in the sunlight, and this is the kind of image that Hesse describes. The young man seemed to him stronger and more impressive than he had hitherto thought, but also harder, more inaccessible, more remote from culture, more pagan. This ceremonial and sacrificial dance under the sign of Pan meant more than young Plinio's speeches and verse-making ever had. It raised the boy several stages higher, but also made him seem more alien, more elusive, less obedient to any summons. In his dance, Tito, without knowing what he was doing, asking no questions, obeyed the command of the ecstatic moment, danced his worship, prayed to the sun, professed his devout movements and gestures in joy, his faith and life, his piety and reverence, both reverently and submissively offered up in the dance his devout soul as a sacrifice to the sun and the gods, and no less to the man he admired and feared, the sage and musician, the master of the magic game, who had come to him from mysterious realms, his future teacher and friend. So Knecht, who's compelled by his admiration for this young Pan, follows him swimmingly into a cold mountain lake. The cold water is too much for the old man, and Knecht drowns. He has like a heart attack or something. Tito, sobered by the experience, goes on to reform his kind of recklessness. And so it would seem that Knecht, in his act of dying, fulfills his final task as a teacher. But I want to return here. So what about Tito's sacrificial dance here? The reference to Pan, the demigod, the one who lulls with music and forgetfulness, is an appropriate image frequently invoked both in the 60s and in the turn of the century children's literature, as a rise in the classical and pagan deities accompanied the perception of an end to metaphysics in general. In Drowning, Knecht merges into a timeless prehistory. The novel then follows with a legendary account of Knecht's life and 3 fictional autobiographies that Knecht had written during his student days, 2 of which are prehistorical as well. The last one, an account of a saintly life. Transcendence then through sacrifice that ecstatically disseminates a life outside of lived time, or what Martin Heidegger had called care or being towards death. Hesse's book itself, as in Knecht's 3 fictional past life accounts, each accounts for Knecht's various incarnations over time. The reason for being in Hesse's novel points toward this enlightened transcendence, but it does so through overcoming histories. Knecht's Drowning represents a well-intentioned will that is overcome by the force of fate, and the narrative of the book presents itself as an entire biography of Knecht. Of the Glass Bead Game itself presents itself as a biography, celebrating his acts. So the will acts to overcome its own intention. In Heidegger's philosophy, it is the taking up of one's angst against one's thrownness into the world in order to live an authentic life. The authentic life is to be praised, glory in the destruction of the will, transcendent merges with impersonal spirit. But the metempsychosis and the return to the perennial is crucial in relaying the fact that it is not just one time, the time of modernity, for example, which is to be overcome through some technologizing account of progress. It's also this return to the ancient. And so in Hesse's novel, Knecht's transcendence makes way for Tito's enlightenment, and moral development, while he himself achieves a sort of bliss in death. Hesse presents then the enlightened subject who is reconstituted through an experience that occupies so much of literature, and psychedelic literature especially, in many ways continues this. The form of the artwork as transferable, containing the experience. And If Upon a Warner's Night, A Traveler by Calvino, later works do this as well. So an easier way to conceptualize this appears phylogenetically in the theme of childhood innocence. In contrast to Hesse during the psychedelic era, Arthur C. Clarke's science fiction novel Childhood's End projects a vision of the human race itself overcoming all subjectivity and ending itself through a mass-scale transmigration of souls. Set in the near future, Clarke describes a mood of, in terms of secular enchantment, quote, "Profounder things had also passed. It was a completely secular age of faiths that had existed before the overcoming of overlords who were sort of aliens from another planet. Only a purified form of Buddhism, perhaps the most austere of all religions, still survived. The creeds that had been based on miracles and revelations had collapsed utterly." Ultimately, however, the narrative of the book arrives at a space beyond humans, or the post-human. There was a quote, here's another quote, there was nothing left of Earth. They, the last generation of children, had leached away the last atoms of substance. It had nourished them through their inconceivable metamorphosis as food stored in a grain of wheat feeds a plant as it climbs toward the sun. In order for the book's narrative to proceed from this point in the novel, the reader must adopt a longing gaze of the alien Karelin. So you become an alien yourself as you read the book, as he contemplates why his race is not allowed to evolve in the ways that humans do. In following Karelin, the reader is invited to transcend humanity itself and become post-human. Tom Wolfe in the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test compares Kesey and the Merry Pranksters to the children in Clarke's novel. Here, the return to nature is not a mere return, but a fulfillment of some sort of evolutionary progress. Wolfe explicitly writes that the entire idea of the psychedelic experience involved in the acid and in the pranksters' performance antics could be found in a long passage from Clarke's book describing total identification, which was itself the product of constructed media space. And so here's the quote. "The history of cinema gave the clue to their actions. First sound, then color, then stereoscopy, then cinerama had made the old moving pictures more and more like reality itself. Where was the end of the story? Surely this final stage would be reached when the audience forgot it was an audience and became part of the action. To achieve this would involve the stimulation of all the senses and perhaps hypnosis as well. When the goal was attained, there would be an enrichment of human experience. A man could become, for a while at least, another person and could take part in any conceivable adventure, real or imaginary. The pranksters, through their performances, through LSD, through becoming aware of their own construction and their movie, re-enchant participatory space. Total identification became the goal of their psychedelic aesthetics, but it was not ideologically just a one-dimensional goal. In Childhood's End, it's significant that the last human, Jan, is a black man. With his characterization, Clarke expands citizenship and inverts the racist primitivism present in the 1950s. Jan remains curious about space travel and he wants to become an astronaut before the overlords had come and made innovation useless to humans because they're so technologically advanced we don't need to innovate anymore. His romantic dreams were not, however, destroyed. Jan attends a party where an alien interested in paranormal activity in humans has come. The partygoers decide to play a Ouija board, and Jan asks it the location of the overlord's home planet. The board, powered by Gene Gregson's latent psychic ability, produces the exact coordinates to the astounded crowd. Jan then decides to stow away on the alien's ship, and while Jean and her husband eventually move to an artist colony called New Athens, where people are suspicious of the overlord's true intentions. Clarke describes New Athens as having been founded by a Jewish man, a nod to the recently created Israeli state merged with an Irenic Greece. He'd been born in Israel, he says, the last independent nation ever to come into existence, and therefore the shortest lived. The end of national sovereignty had been felt here perhaps more bitterly than anywhere else, for it is hard to lose a dream which one has just achieved after centuries of striving. In Wolff's connection to the goals of the acid test being the total identification achieved by the children in Clarke's novel with the overmind, the tests also push towards a deterritorialization and transcendence of nation states. In doing so, they appear to have given up transcendent religion altogether. But secularization is also overcome through the enchantment of this psychic mind. Childhood as a theme in the works of the merry pranksters found important, or the works that the pranksters found important, was not just a return to the romantic construction of childhood innocence. Childhood also works as a theme in psychedelic aesthetics to invoke the perennial through the nostalgia produced by modernity's claim to a temporal past and an alienation from a state of nature. History is overcome then by moving towards a pre-political state of nature, both before and beyond the nation state. Yet simultaneously, this supposedly phylogenetic overcoming of history is actually a recasting of Euro-Christian fantasy structure onto a pleasantly innocent youthfulness, which unwittingly, in its perennialist return to nature, actualizes a flattened universalizing of the human condition that merely perpetuates earlier forms of Euro-Christian domination, only now in a secular or post-secular, spiritual but not religious awareness. It is that very subjectivity that perpetuates a globalized extractivist mode of consumption, long incubated within Euro-Christian capitalism, and even its dialectical tension with Marxian trajectories. Spirituality here may not even recognize itself as Euro-Christian derived in its implementation of the basileia tau theo, enacted by liberal subjects who, in their own enchanted awareness, have transcended the moral authority of the nation state to fulfill the extractive intention of an invisible hand. Thanks.
Thanks, Roger. That was a fascinating. Used the phrase "imaginary journey" at one point, and that's exactly what you just took us on. And the very end, the final, well, I'd say the last 2 minutes, you packed in a lot of theory and a lot of ideas, and I'm interested to see how we unpack that. Carl Raschke, you have the first chance to respond.
Well, actually, I'm not responding. I'm giving a presentation here. And then
I'd like to go ahead and give your presentation.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm gonna follow up with the question. So how did the psychedelic era turn into the era of neoliberalism? And I think Roger kind of gave a kind of account of that at the very end right there. I want to go back to what was one of the slogans of the late 60s and early 70s. I said late 60s because it wasn't really formulated until 1969. And that was a saying by Carol Hanisch, who wrote an essay in 1969. She was one of the architects, prime movers of what's often known as second wave feminism. And that was the phrase, the personal is political. In some ways, that is a kind of epitomization of everything we might call about the 60s mentalities and the 60s epistemic modalities. The
Carl,
60s.
Hear what you said. Say the quote again. It cut out right at the wrong second. Sorry for everyone. I need to hear what you said again. What's the quote?
I wasn't giving a quote. I was making a statement.
No. That the thing was the something is the political. I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, the personal is the political, from Carl Hanisch. Okay, everybody get that? Yeah, we've heard that before probably. The 60s was an era of the hyper-personalization as well as the hyper-privatization of culture. And I'll explain how that happened. It became such a way that in the late 1970s, Christopher Lasch, the famous social critic and theorist, wrote a best-selling book call the culture of narcissism, which is being taken up today by many who are critiquing, including myself, the culture of neoliberalism, particularly what Nancy Fraser, in her groundbreaking essays right around the time of the 2016 election, calls progressive neoliberalism. There's a difference here because neoliberalism, which was originally an economic term, has been, I think, misappropriated by many theorists. It's a conservative ideology when in fact it goes back to the 60s and it is a progressive ideology. There's a book by Adam Kotsko, which came out a year before mine, called Neoliberalism's Demons. He tries to, in a sense, tie neoliberalism to the Reagan, quote, revolution or the Reagan reaction, as well as to the rise of evangelicalism, particularly political evangelicalism, which he grew up in. I maintain this is all wrong. Neoliberalism, if we follow Foucault, is about the markets, and it was essentially the progressive movement which adopted neoliberalism to create the global order that I think most of us find problematic and so forth. So what we see in the 1960s is the fragmentation of the rational neoliberal subject. The relation between subjectivity and rationality is in many respects the heart of the problem of subjectivity overall. And it's the heart of, and it gets down to the very basis of what happened in the 1960s. And in many ways, the operative term in the 1960s was alternative. And the whole notion to try to find alternatives, alternativity, was in itself called a movement with a capital M. So how did this happen? Well, we see basically the breakdown of what James Scott, who's an anthropologist, calls high modernism, which is, he says high modernism was in many ways the kind of faith, the rational faith of not only the Enlightenment, but in many respects was the heritage of the Western Reformation itself. The emergence of the modern subject is also the emergence of the liberal subject. And liberalism and high modernism are tied in intimately with a confidence in science and the autonomy of the rational agent, particularly the rational moral agent. Now, this goes all the way back to John Locke, but is refined by Kant. That's why in my book, Neoliberalism, Political Theology, From Kant to Identity Politics, which is published in 2019 by Edinburgh University Press, I refer to Kant as in many ways the sort of founding or tutelary deity of the neoliberal mind. So what was Kant really talking about then that we have to take into serious consideration there? Sorry, my turned my phone off there. Kant, in his essay, What is Enlightenment, talks about what this kind of rationality is. He talks about it as an emancipated universal rationality. He says that it's summed up in the expression dare to know, sapere aude, in Latin, release from one's self-incurred tutelage. Now, the word tutelage in English is the common translation of the German word Unmündigkeit, which literally means immaturity. So enlightenment is this kind of universal rationality, which is a release at a collective human level from our self-incurred, immaturity. Now notice the term self-incurred, because we incur it through, in some ways, our failure to exercise our reason, our God-given, naturally endowed, rational nature, and to an sense express our yearning for the transcendent in this particular way. The yearning for transcendence, which is in many ways the key to religion. By the way, this was a term that was thrown about constantly throughout the 1960s, transcendence. It's about finding transcendence, finding the illimitable, going beyond the boundaries of what, the mind can possibly conceive. This was in many ways characteristic of the Enlightenment, as Theodore Roszak wrote about in his book called The Making of a Counterculture. He called it a kind of new romanticism as a rejection of the Enlightenment. But in many ways, it was different than the Romantic era because it was not an aristocratic movement. It was an effort to try to tap what might be called the deeper transcendence within the structure of human rationality, which many people in the 60s, particularly intellectuals, saw as, not only challenged by the Freudian hypothesis, but at the same time was something that what we might call the Enlightenment model of reason can no longer capture. When Kant, in his Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, called about a religion without religion, a term that is taken up in recent years as a kind of slogan of postmodernism by John D. Caputo. He was really, in a sense, pointing to this idea that was rife throughout the 1960s of this kind of transcendent rationality, which goes beyond the kind of formal rationality that was allowed only for, scholars and also aristocrats. For Kant, and this is why Kant was criticized so heavily by Nietzsche, because Nietzsche didn't like the idea of the rationality of the common human being. Kant believed that this moral transcendence was something that was capable of every person, regardless of their level of education, in fact, by virtue of being human. And he summed this up in the so-called categorical imperative. Act in such a way that your principle of rational action becomes a universal maxim for all rational beings. But rationality for Kant is not a given. It has to be developed, cultivated, formed. It has to be managed, so to speak, by formal institutions that will create a whole social order that is derived from its free exercise among individuals. The German word that Kant used is, of course, Bildung, B-I-L-D-U-N-G, which means formation. But it's also related etymologically to the English word Bildung. The German word Ausbildung, that is building out or a build out, is the word that is used for education, particularly higher education. Hence, in a sense, to fulfill the imperative enlightenment for Kant is to focus on education, not just self-education, self-development. In many ways, the whole notion of the self-help movement, as it's called in American society, and in the 1960s, it was called the human potential movement, realizing these untapped potentiality or dynamic forces within each of us. This requires an institutional structure, an educational structure. So in other words, I would argue that the 60s was not so much as it still is considered by its conservative critics to be an outburst of irrationalism, but it was an effort to find a kind of more profounder and a more expansive rationalism that went beyond the kind of dictates of what one would call technocratic rationality, particularly the technocratic rationality that was used by capitalism to dominate the world. And for Kant, this new rationality is found in morality. Now, Kant distinguishes in the critique of practical reason between what he calls the good will and the pragmatic will, or between pure moral self-determination and what he calls utilitarian morality. Utilitarian morality has an end in mind. It is a means to an end. Pure rational morality, according to Kant, is an end in itself. Reason, by its very nature, has its interests. For pragmatic rationality, for pragmatic morality, the interests are those of the individual. For Kantian morality, the interest of reason is itself, and the interest of reason is fulfilled in the moral law. Kant, in his famous line from his later writings, talks about the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Kant, of course, was a pietist. He was a child of the Radical Reformation, but a Radical Reformation that had been totally taken over by the Enlightenment. So for him, inner transcendence, we might call that, the new kind of deeper alternative rationality was to be found in morality. And I always argue this is essentially what the principle of neoliberalism is. I'm in agreement, I think, very much with Wendy Brown on this. I won't talk a lot about the literature on neoliberalism. You could read my book on that. But I'll take that as a starting point. Because for Kant, religion and rationality go together. There's a rationality that emerges after the religious impulse is in many ways expressed. So one thing we might call it is an expressive rationality. America has always been, as many critics have said, and many people who are trying to defend, the traditional American legacy today, particularly, when they talk about Supreme Court decisions, say we're essentially a religious nation. And historically, that's pretty much true. America was founded, and I'm not speaking from the Native American perspective here, I'm talking about within the standpoint of the ideology of American exceptionalism, was an errand in the wilderness undertaken by religious dissenters, those who in some ways had discovered the deeper meaning, the more committed meaning of what religion. Religion is not just a kind of social practice. Religion is a whole way of life. It's a way of dedicating yourself in an absolute way to the absolute God. And so that was in many ways a summary of what many of these streams that became the Radical Reformation, including German pietism, who many of these religious dissenters migrated to America. They were all at odds with each other, but in some ways they all formed the European complex. And they began to see their own religious working out of this sense of divine destiny as having a rationality to it. That's why I would argue that if you look historically at the whole idea of manifest destiny in America, which was a term that was not coined into the 1840s, but it was used to justify the Western expansion of America and also later colonialism, is that it was a religious calling, a deep, profound religious calling, primarily a Christian calling, but it also had its Jewish supporters as well, to, in a sense, bring about the kingdom of God on earth. And what happened as a result of this religious impulse became rationalized as, well, this is the American way. This was God's providence. The philosopher Hegel, in his book on the philosophy of history in the 1840s, called this the cunning of history. Der List der Vernunft. The cunning the cunning of reason. The cunning of reason is a rationality that is realized after the fact, after what Hegel says, one exercises one's passions, and in a sense, one makes decisions that don't necessarily have an immediate interest or an end in mind, but in a sense are done out of this pure kind of internal transcendent compulsion. And once they're done, the order that we get is seen as, in some ways, being what God intended all along. In other words, it is rational. Now, I want to get to how this all affects the 60s. I'm laying this out as background. What happened in the 60s is this idea of what you might call American exceptionalism, or the rationality of American triumphalism after the fact, as the outworking of a destiny that religious devotion and religious passion had set about. And I just want to make a comment here before I go any further, that this still goes on in the academic world, a lot of debate about, what America's founding principles were. Was it founded on Enlightenment principles or was founded on religious principles? And the answer, it was both. It was founded on the kind of rational religiosity that we find articulated most perspicuously in a philosopher like Kant, though nobody had ever heard of Kant, of course, in America up until the middle of the 19th century. was in many ways Kantianism became the sort of manifest destiny of Germany itself in the 19th century, and with all the German immigration that took place from particularly around the 1760s up until the 1870s, when my own ancestors, who were actually from Silesia, from Eastern Europe, the Slavic part of Germany, migrated as draft dodgers from the Franco-Prussian War, but they bore this kind of Kantian legacy, and that played into, in many ways, what we might call American civil religion, which I'm not going to talk about here, but it's an interesting topic in itself. Because the 60s was the breakdown not only of the, what we might call the architectonic, I'm using a Kantian term there, liberal rationality of the Enlightenment, but it was also a breakdown of the civil religion, the sense of civic mission, which in its more extreme forms was predatory, manifest destiny, colonialism, genocide, slavery, etc. But each one of those can't be just simply subsumed under this paradigm. They have to be critically analyzed, as trends or movements in their own right. But there became this grand disillusionment with the civic religion. Now, again, I'm talking primarily about the dominant white society here, because these were in many ways the bearers of the intellectual tradition, and they were also the agents for its critique and its transformation. And in the critique itself became a new form of domination, which I argue in our book, which we know as neoliberalism. But what happened was a kind of disenchantment, a kind of terror that had not sunk in even after the Second World War, because America had won that war, but it had not been devastated domestically in the way Europe had. But it was the Cold War, the fact that we were not alone in the world as this new hegemon after the Second World War. This was the anti-communism, the Stalinists, the Red Scare. And this culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when for a week in October, it looked like the world was actually going to blow up. So previous wars had always been to defend democracy as a commonwealth of rational decision makers, in some ways the paradigm of the Republic. But the Vietnam War was not rational. It started out as the fruit of very careful technocratic planning, but it was also in some ways an inevitable failure, because the planners were pushed further and further by a kind of logic that was not rational. That is the rational of America's religious destiny. America couldn't let Southeast Asia go to the communists, because communism was not only anti-American, it was anti-Enlightenment, it was anti-democratic, and the so-called domino theory. If they take Saigon, then they're going to take Australia, and then they're going to take San Francisco, and on and on and on. It was based on this notion of America's rationality is under grave threat. But it was also at the same time that because of the emphasis on higher education, that Americans began to discover for the first time, or at least became seared into their consciousness, the contradictions of their own heritage. Particularly with the civil rights movement, they began to discover the contradictions of Jim Crow. The fact that let's call it the Kantian imperative in American destiny was only for a certain privileged few, particularly those with a certain kind of racial characteristics. But it wasn't just about race, it was also about other forms of exception, i.e. gender, though in those days we didn't use the word, we talked about sex. In fact, it was the women's movement, second generation feminism that I mentioned before. What was called, in 1969, there was a cover story with a woman with a black power, raising a black power fist, even though she was white, and it was called Women's Liberation. And that was the beginning of what we call radical feminism. The idea that women, it's not about equality, it's about the expressive identity of women to become women and to, in a sense, have not only equal rights, but to be recognized for who they are as women. This same mentality, which in many ways was, and in this way the conservatives are very crudely right, it was a form of Marxism, but it actually was not sanctioned by the Marxists. It was in many ways a rejection of the Marxist rhetoric, particularly of class consciousness, that class consciousness really is in some ways a form of white male hegemony. So it was within the quote movement itself that what we call identity politics, or as it was known at the time as the politics of recognition, began to emerge. Now, I'm running out of time here, and I want to get to something that I think is key, in the formation of neoliberalism. The 60s was also the beginning of a new kind of economic rationality. It was not a rationality of a deeper transcendence, but it was a rationality that flew in the face of what Weber had called the Protestant ethics. Weber had pointed out that capitalism and the Protestant ethic went hand in hand with each other. But now, in light of the experience of the 1930s and the 1940s, that this idea that, in a sense, one produces goods, one accumulates capital for the glory of God, went out the window, because this was the ethic of producer capitalism, which was based on the Protestant ethic. And the 30s had shown just the fraud of this idea, just like the 1960s had demonstrated the fraud of the idea of American manifest destiny. So what we had in the 60s was the beginning of what Daniel Bell calls consumer capitalism, an idea which he analyzes and pushes forward, which we now take for granted, but which was, in many respects, a new idea in the 1960s. The title of his book is called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And he points out, in a sense, this contradiction between production and consumption, which Keynes had discovered in his economics, that you can't have production without consumption. So how do you stimulate consumption? And that, in many ways, was the genius of Madison Avenue in the 1950s. Madison Avenue didn't discover consumer advertising. The theory of it was developed in the 1920s as a result of the kind of population of Freudian theory. But in Neo-Freudianism, which was the dominant form of psychoanalysis in the 1950s, talked about ego formation, the formation of the self, and the creation of a healthy identity. So Vance Packard had written a book about how this was done by advertising agencies in the 1950s. It was called The Hidden Persuaders. And it was like, you have to manipulate the unconscious. You have to create wants and desires of people who don't realize that they really want this. It's not about doing good. It's not about solving your family. It's about another form of transcendence, which is not a spiritual or moral self-transcendence, but a self-transcendence to desire. One of the things that Madison Avenue discovered, and you can see this in some of the sub-themes of a popular show like Mad Men, is that people don't know what they want, but what they want is everything that everybody else wants. They want to, as the phrase went in the 1950s, they want to keep up with the Joneses. Jacques Lacan formulated this in his seminars during the same period, using a famous phrase that all desire is the desire of the other. It's like we want what others want, and we want what, and we act on our wants in such a way that we think they will want, and we see these as our own desires. In consumer capitalism, therefore, it's not about creating more things so much as selling more of the same thing and creating the issue, in creating the issuing of more. There was another book that was published in the 60s, which became in many ways not only just the new Bible of this marketing movement, but of the beginnings of neoliberalism itself. And it was a Harvard economist by the name of Theodore Levitt, who wrote a book called The Marketing Imagination. Interesting, Levitt was also the one that invented the term at the time called globalization. Levitt's theory was in the marketing imagination that it's not about creating new products, it's about it's about creating experiences. People, in a sense, take the same product but experience it in a new way. And his theory was not, as it is in the restaurant industry, location, 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 but differentiation, differentiation, differentiation. So in other words, in a sense, you're consuming the same thing, but you're having a different kind of experience to go along with it. I have an interesting story from my growing up, which I've told many people. I don't have time, so I won't get into that. Now, what LSD became, and I'll get to this real quickly, LSD became the agent for the makedown of the breakdown of the liberal rational order, and therefore the mystification of experience, which opened up a whole new world, you might call an empire of desire, by which people could want experiences that they'd never had before. To go through what Victor Turner, the anthropologist, called the liminal space in which people's selves are transformed. Todd Gitlin, and here's a book, if one really wants to kind of look at the book, a book that talks about the 60s, it's called The 60s Years of Hope, Days of Rage. He says that throughout the 60s, in our political activism, we wondered endlessly about who we are. He said the theory of identity comes from Madison Avenue, but we adopted it to politics. The new ego psychology became a form of activism, particularly among the children of traditional radicals, the so-called red diaper babies. Their children had been communists in the 60s, even Stalinists in the 50s. But now they saw the great, consumer cornucopia before them, and they wanted to transform the world to be good Marxists, but they wanted to have the same experiences that advertising offered. And he called this the new expressive politics of the New Left. The New Left and the hippie movement, basically, he says, converged out of this push for self-othering. But in many ways, you can't become an other without, in a sense, deciding who you're going to become. And who one sought to become now was not the heritage you were born in, but the other. Norman Mailer, in his essay, The White Negro in 1957, probably put this on the line very carefully. That, in other words, many people want to be black. Why? Because they don't know what white means anymore, because white means liberal, which means rational, which means, in a sense, you are a prisoner of the consumer society. You don't want a house in the handlooms anymore. You want to change the world. You want to identify with the dispossessed. And so this is, of course, the beginning of the process of cultural appropriation, which Mailer, as far back as 1950s, pointed out was the future of the new expressive politics. So to sum up then, expressive culture and expressive politics turn into a kind of professionalism in the 1970s. You can see this in a popular movie called The Big Chill, the kind of disenchantment with the 60s, and also the kind of sense of the pointlessness of it all, and even the kind of new nihilism that is beginning to emerge. It's all about me. Popular book that was written during this period, looking out for number one. Getting an education, becoming a business major, becoming a tycoon, becoming rich, becoming a cocaine dealer, getting rid of your LSD or your marijuana, which are about feeling cool and hip, and in a sense, taking drugs would stimulate you to manifest your own personal drive. The empire of desire becomes the empire of ego. And this is also a time in which marketing now begins to appropriate people's dissatisfaction with the reigning order. And since the discovery that if you're going to have a true global economy and capitalism going to expand, you have to play, following Levitt, on other people's identities. You have to market to their identities, particularly their sense of otherness, even people's faux sense of otherness. Zizek's essay in 1997, Multiculturalism, the Logic of Multinational Capitalism, talks about how multinational capitalism requires the diversity of expressive identities and expressive selves. So I'm over time a little bit, and I kind of ran through that last part there, but it's kind of my analysis, and we can bring out more of that in the give and take.
Thanks, Carl. Really appreciated that, and I think it sets up an interesting juxtaposition with Roger's presentation. Seemed like there's two different classes that both of you were addressing in the 60s, interestingly. But yeah, I'll let the two of you discuss that and work that out. Now we have a bit of time for discussion between Carl and Roger. And then after their original discussion, we're going to open it up for Q&A. I left a comment in the chat box. I hope you all can see that and see some of the conversations going on there already. But if you have a question, just write in that chat box, I have a question, or you can go ahead and write out your question in that section there. And that way we can be reflecting on it and then discuss it. So Carl, Roger, please.
Carl and I talk all the time, so unless Carl had a specific question for me, I'm happy to jump straight to questions that Patrick has a comment for us to talk more about some things. And Sarah Pessin says she has a question.
Yeah, that's fine. I just want to say, and again, I'm not saying this pridefully or to give myself some, kind of privilege here, but unlike many here, I actually lived through the 60s, not necessarily chronological, but being there in the heart of the movement. Berkeley in the late 60s, I was there. I went to Boston, which was sort of Berkeley West in the early 70s, and I was involved in it, culturally as well as politically in many respects. And so I don't speak from history books, even though history books are very useful for me. When Todd Gitlin writes about, for example, in the 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, which is a very, I think, good summary title of what the 60s is about. He talks about the People's Park riot as kind of the turning point. I want to say not only I was there, I was taking a course in liberal theology, which ended with a tear gas canister being thrown through the window. That sort of became a metaphor for both the beginning of my academic career and the end of what might be called the Years of Hope.
Well, Roger, if you like, we can go ahead and take a question from Patrick. Patrick, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I was Carl, you brought this that last point about this kind of like somebody sort of claiming sort of blackness, right? Because they didn't quite understand what white or want to be identified white. I think we see this sort of taken to the nth degree in contemporary culture, sort of transracialism, and I guess I don't know what the exact terminology for it is, but people who are not disabled, sort of saying that they feel like they identify as disabled, sort of these unrooted, I would say, unrooted identity claims as forms of subjectivity. They masquerade as radicalism, but are really just a flip side of radical individuality, I would say, and kind of confirm Roger's point that some of these movements out of the 60s, they reinscribe what they portend to critique. If both of you could speak to some of these trends, that would be great.
If I could add one point, which I didn't because I was running out of time. You need to read Mailer's essay because it was very influential at the time. And of course, a lot of people don't even know who Norman Mailer is. In many ways, some of you have noticed my Twitter account. I don't fall in line with all the kind of days of rage today, particularly among people in their 20s and 30s, just because I've lived through it. And I see the 60s being kind of recycled right now in some ways in even less authentic ways. And a lot of my skepticism about what's happening right now is because of lived experience, not because I'm, an old fuddy-duddy or anything like that. That in some ways we are still Americans, and the American obsession with itself is a kind of global narcissism that we still don't seem to be working out. We think that all the world's problems are our problems, but there's still the problems of the elites. That's, I think the one issue. But what Mailer says is basically, he actually says the hipster is the white Negro. He's not writing a racial essay so much. He's laying out the theory of cultural appropriation and of identitarianism as a way of, in a sense, of not coming to terms with your own, loss of purpose. You still have a sense of manifest destiny, but it's a manifest destiny within yourself. It's a manifest destiny that is in some ways nihilism. It fits very well with what Nietzsche wrote about in The Will of Power. It's, it's the end of the West, not the beginning. And it's a pathology of the elites. And Mailer identified this back in 1957, believe it or not. What's his name? David Brooks, I'm sorry, the New York Times columnist. A lot of people don't like, he's on PBS, and, I have mixed feelings about Brooks, but, he's very articulate, and sometimes he writes very insightful pieces. He wrote an essay around right after the turn of the millennium called the Bohemian Bourgeoisie. And he talked about it was the same time that Richard Florida had written this best-selling book called The Rise of the Creative Class. The new, these people who are creatives, that's a term right now. It doesn't mean artists, it means the new technocrats, the new digital nomads, who, by the way, was a self-identification of this woman in Canada who tried to send this ricin to Donald Trump. She's obviously, self-identifies with that, with Florida's idea. People who are highly educated, but people who feel uprooted, don't know who they are or what they want, but they have a passion. They have a passion to save the world somehow and so forth. It's still, in ways, this kind of Kantian rationality, which is now expressed as a form of neoliberal domination. And, neoliberalism is not about, conservatives trying to take over the world. Conservatives read something like the book, not the book, the movie, With God on Our Side. It was a documentary about the rise of the religious right that came out just when George Bush was running for president. And the way in which he leveraged the religious right. George Bush didn't win the 2000 election by a hair's breadth because he had the religious right behind him. Ronald Reagan had it too, but what he did was he was able to, in some ways, to keep it intact for the last time so he could maintain this sort of progressive neoliberal idea, which he expressed in the idea of the compassionate conservative. And Bill Clinton, his third way, this was all part of the kind of neoliberal rise. It was a identity politics, the politics of self-interest as self-transcendence, through creating a notion that you are special, you have unique experience, you have to experience everything else. That's why you have to accumulate degrees. You're not just a working class stiff anymore. You're not like Archie Bunker, who was the kind of foil of the 1970s, but you are the new people that are in control. You are part of the empire of desire, which is a global empire. And so one really needs to go read Mailer's book, because Mailer is probably the unsung prophet of the 60s and 70s that many of us have sort of forgotten. I know I might let Roger say something about that. I know He's never mentioned Norman Mailer to me, but
I'm not going to talk about Mailer's essay. It's an important essay, but just in the interest of people who haven't read it right now, I want to talk about speak to Patrick's statement from a different tack, and I want to think about the late '60s and the birth of terrorism in the U.S. and in Germany, because I want to try and make that kind of connection just for the audience today. Of course, so terrorism, we could take back to state terrorism of the French Revolution and all, and make a kind of genealogical history there. But I just want to sort of look at this kind of radical individualism and what happens both in Germany and in the US and in other places during '68. So this is happening all over the world, and it happened different reactions in different places. They gunned the students down in Mexico City, for example, in '68. And then, we get Ohio State in 1970 in the US, but what you see is this increasing radicalization. You see affluent left society like having a failure of compassion for so what they seek to do is to align themselves with, especially in Germany, with people like Franz Fanon, with post-colonial thought of the sort of what we now call, or people now are used to call for a while, the third world, right? So the post-colonial entities, the German left, the German youth really saw a kind of alignment with global post-colonialism because they wanted to see themselves as being against the Nazi past of their parents. And so by claiming a kind of world consciousness, they wanted to reach out to the proletariat, what they saw as the proletariat. You see this going on in France in May of '68 as well. And you see it going on in the US to a different degree, this attempt of privileged youth to align themselves with proletariat or with previously colonized places in the world. And it shows up in more or less radicalizations. So yes, you have the Weather Underground in the United States, but then you have the Red Army faction in Germany, and the Baader-Meinhof group. That's what they're called sometimes. And so you get this kind of radicalization. The only thing that the liberals can do is to radicalize and become terrorists themselves, right? So that impulse towards terrorism we see both on the right and the left in the 20th, like we could just fast forward to 2020 and we have these kind of from the early 70s to the 2020, the militarization of the police, the creation of what looks like, some kinds of secret police, unmarked police, in places like Portland, the alignment of the police with neo-fascist groups and white supremacist groups, the overt, allowance of that sort of thing is happening at the same time that you see the radical individualization of the one guy with the gun protesting, and not being seen as a threat, but the movement for Black Lives, people who are not armed are being seen as a threat. And then of course the mask issues as well. So that's the hyper individualism I think that we see, where it's just a complete blur. I call it a political vortex between right and left. It doesn't really, those kinds of metaphors don't really matter so much anymore. So I wanted to maybe push to Sarah's question just to get more voices in here.
I just quickly add something that I think it's important, that I think this will in some ways feed into what I know is Sarah's interest. There's kind of this messianism in all of this. And I want to read quickly a quote from Gitling's book, 60 Years of Hope, Days of Rage. It's on page 213. Where he talks about the tensions between the political and the experiential. He says, despite these tensions, there was a direct line from the expressive politics of the new left to the counterculture's let it all hang out way of life. He talks about the people of SNCC when they shifted to LSD. He says SDS, that was Student for a Democratic Society, which was the kind of prototype of the new left. SDS's Prairie Power generation in 1965 saw no barrier between radical politics and drug culture. The New Left's founding impulse said from the start, create the future in the present. Sit in right now at the lunch counter as if race didn't count. Historically, the traditions were tangled, intertwined. The synthesizers took up a grand American tradition of trying to fuse public service and private joy. The masses, for example, the pre-World War I magazine that brought the cultivation of self and youth cheek to jowl with socialism, feminism, and the anti-war crusade. Now there was a populace on which to dream, the unleashed young, the so-called youth quake, as it was called. On the verge of 1967 Summer of Love, many were the radicals and cultural revolutionaries in search of convergence, trying to nudge the new left and the counterculture together to imagine them as yin and yang of the same epical world transformation.
That's a great quote.
let me jump in, Carl. Because I guess what I'm gonna say is somewhat related to the messianism frame. So good call on that, was forecasting what my question was about. So I guess my question for Roger and Carl is just if they can speak a little bit about, and this might just be a sort of big background question, but it would be helpful for me, about what is, at the methodological level, what do you take yourselves to be doing vis-a-vis the question of ideology and whether it is surmountable? So in other words, critique at some level is a way of creating new spaces, but I guess if it would just be helpful for me to hear both of you talk a little bit about, when we read with both of you and see these different critiques and ways of seeing the links between the 60s and liberalism, what is the activity that we're doing related to the question of, is ideology something that can be shifted, surmounted, or not? And if yes or no, what are we doing? And I guess relatedly, I see in, Roger and Carl both talked about multiple pieces, but in some respects, Roger ended with the idea of, the 60s running into this, what he described as Euro-Christian flattening universalizing of the human condition. And Carl ended off talking about the opposite of that, which is like a hyper individual, empire of ego. So I guess both speakers, in a way, there's like pincers of like opposing pathologies, right? It leads me to ask, related to the first question, is it the case that within an ideological tunnel that we're in, no matter what you do, is going to run into a neoliberal affront? Or in other words, to say it differently, given that the way the 60s leads to neoliberalism, it leads to it if you go too much on the universal, and it leads to it if you go too much on the particular. So that leads me to ask, if you could both reflect on that, and does that mean that there's just simply no way out once a certain course of history is underway? No matter what you do at this point, you're going to be kind of, even if you think you're breaking out of neoliberalism, you're actually just going to be, in 5 years from now, we're going to tell the story of how you did this other neoliberal thing. I guess these are interrelated questions. So I just want to know, I'm commenting on the fact that both of you showed how it leads to neoliberalism, whether you focus on the universal or on the particular, if that's one way to say it. But then relatedly, I guess I want to know, what is this activity that we're doing? And is there any, to the messianic point, is there any kind of way of actually opening this space? I just want to hear you both speaking of what you think about that.
Could I add a tiny addendum to that question?
Sarah had a quick question. She said
I'm really interested in Sarah's question too, in so far as, first she asks kind of the methodological question and what you see yourselves doing with this, I think you can call it a genealogy of the 60s, and kind of a political genealogy. So what's going on methodologically? What's to be done with neoliberalism, kind of the $1 million question. And then third, in the title of both of your most recent books, you understand yourselves as doing political theology. So if I could just circle on that, back on that first part, how do you understand your, I'm not questioning that what you're doing is political theology, but how do you understand the political theology that you're doing? That's what I mean.
Okay.
I would say that what I am doing is political theology, but I'll defer to Roger because let him start.
Yeah, so just on the methodological question, I'm just gonna tell you this. I work with the literary. I'm primarily interested in the literary, and so what I'm doing is a kind of cultural poetics, which is a term that comes from Stephen Greenblatt, who's often pegged as a new historicist, but I like the term cultural poetics. I'm going to use a quotation here just really quickly from Daniel Boyarin, who uses the similar method. In a book called Carnal Israel, which is a totally different subject, but I just like the way he sums up what we do. It is a practice that respects the literariness of the literary text, that is, as texts that are marked by rhetorical complexity and for which that surface formal feature is significant for their interpretation, while attempting at the same time to understand how they function within a larger socio-cultural system of practices. So we look at a text as a kind of reflection, but something that presents itself as literary itself. And in addition to what Boyarin says, what I'm trying to do is to approach the reading of genres with a certain degree of flexibility, what Michel Foucault has called discourses, or while also trying to attend to the nuances within these discussions. And this is something that's typical of all of my writing or recent writing on the New Polis, is this interest in the literary, what philosophers do with the literary. Sometimes I think philosophers take literary examples as what Aristotle calls inartistic proofs instead of artistic proofs, only to further their own arguments. So the uses of literature is something that I'm interested in as well. As this complex of discourses. So that's what I'm doing as an analytical method, and to the extent that I extract that into some sort of cultural formations, like to the movement for Black Lives in that recent answer, is a way of first grounding and then extrapolating from that. Why I'm interested in the 60s and in aesthetics in general is I think that there is something in Marcuse's, what Herbert Marcuse called the aesthetic dimension. Yes, I know that there are criticisms for this, to this, but I believe that what has been lost through identity politics, through neoliberalism, is a sense of something that aesthetics do, and that when that is mystified, it is completely dangerous in the Levinasian sense, and when it is completely unaccounted for, you're left in this space between what Walter Benjamin calls in the work of art of like the aestheticization of politics and the politics of aesthetics at the end of that particular essay. So that's what I'm kind of trying to do. And then, of course, I was trying to lead into Carl's talk because I knew he was going to talk about neoliberalism. I'll talk about political theology in a minute, but that's my method.
Well, I had mentioned Adam Kotsko before his book, which came out a year before mine. And I think his book's probably been read more than mine, simply because, the publisher, offered for $20, and I didn't realize this. Edinburgh University Press only offered it in hardback. It may be, coming down in price now. It seems that people are reading it, but it's a wholly different argument about what neoliberalism is, and it's there are demons, but the demons are not the demons of conservatives, the demons of people who think that they're changing the world, demons we haven't confronted yet. And what I want to do is, because I remember, to give a personal reminiscence. I was in a seminar at it was a philosophical seminar at the University of California, Berkeley, in the winter of it was winter or spring in 1968. I remember it was right about the time where I almost got drafted to go to the Vietnam War, and that's a story in itself, which I'm writing about in my memoirs. And the professor, who was from India, we didn't have such a thing as post-colonial theory at the time, but I think you could call him a post-colonial theorist because he was very interesting in what he said. And of course, I wasn't acquainted with anything at the time. I was only 24 years old, actually, and immersing myself in this topic. But he said, he says what's happening now this very year is that we are in control for the first time in history. And people asked him, what do you mean by the we? He said, we, the intelligentsia, we, the academics, for the first time, we are in control. And that struck with him because Peter Drucker, when he wrote this essay, right in the late 90s, I think it was, we talked about the knowledge worker and the new knowledge society, and in some ways we live in a whole new form of capitalism, digital capital, but it's what Bernard Stiegler calls immaterial capitalism. It's a capitalism that is basically built upon the creation of human capital and human potential and human experiences. This, of course, what Zizek's talking about, is what Stiegler is talking about, a lot of these basically famous critical theorists, but we see, in some ways, we listen to these people as, and including the feminists. This is what's so interesting about Nancy Fraser to me. She is one of the foremost feminist theorists, and she was the first to say the emperor has no clothes. Her essay, which appeared in Dissent, the very month Trump was elected, and she talked about progressive neoliberalism, and said, we see the 2000 section is this kind of, resurgence of barbarism. But she said, actually, it's a reaction to progressive neoliberalism and the system of domination that's perfected itself. And we haven't realized that yet. Not that I'm defending Trumpism whatsoever, by any means, but, you can't, we're, as intellectuals, we're famous for talking about, the people who we see as terrorists, trying to understand them. And we don't understand them, the populists, the Modis of India and so forth, we throw around this term fascism because, we don't understand ourselves. We don't understand, to what degree we are, like in the famous line of Pogo, he was talking about the Vietnam War, he was talking about America. He said, we have met the enemy and it's ourselves. Maurizio Lazzarato, in his book, The Making of Indebted Man, which is, he's writing from a neo-Marxist perspective. And in some ways, I think we need to discover what real Marxism really means, because Marxism is about class and inequality. This was the issue that the 60s never addressed and still hasn't being addressed. And with COVID, it's becoming even more pronounced, economic inequality and the self-consciousness that comes with that. You can't have society based on, neoliberal elites who become increasingly wealthy, who claim to justify themselves in the name of some kind of higher historical destiny or good, even if it's now understood as global. Because underneath that, there are many who don't have the voice, who cannot articulate it, who see the fraud. This is what post-colonialism is all about. In some ways, the worldwide populist movement, which we don't have to accept it or embrace it, we certainly need to understand it, is in many ways a form of anti-neoliberal post-colonialism, a colonialism of disenfranchised people, not the educated elites, who become the dominant economic elites. And that's sort of my methodology to get to that point. How did we get there? Well, we got this way from, the people who revolted in Berkeley. The 60s was the first, quote, revolution that didn't begin, at the factory door, nor did it begin in the in the working class compounds. It began in the university, the free speech movement, 1964. That was the beginning of what was called the movement, and it was intellectual elites who, in a sense, redefine history for themselves in a first way with a whole new kind of subjectivity, a desire that became economized and commodified and ultimately became a dominant system. And we are the products of this. We have to understand this. If we don't understand this, we're going to be lost with what's coming. And what's coming is something that's not very pretty. And I don't want to go there, but
the last thing you said, if we don't, that's what I want to just clarify. If we don't realize this, then what? Say that sentence again. Like, what if we do realize it? What's the difference? Like, that's the part I want to hear you say.
I think if we do realize it, we can, we can retool, very quickly. I mean, we realize that there,
Are
like,
you
for
sure about
example, the whole issue of systemic racism in America. I don't want to get into this right now, but this is the way this is being addressed now. The term systemic racism came up in the late '60s. I remember there was part of the whole New Left repertoire of issues, particularly in the Black Panther movement.
Carl, are you how is knowing about it, how can we quickly retool? So in other words, here's 12 of us or whatever.
You have to understand what the goals are. In some ways the goals are, it's what the whole notion of the politics of recognition was all about. And interesting, a guy like Fukuyama, in his book called The Politics of Recognition, he was the one, of course, who wrote, The Last Man in the End of History, was the famous neoliberal manifesto. Fukuyama basically says, we've forgotten it's all about dignity. It's about dignity and recognition of the other. And it's not accidental, Sarah, that I end my book on neoliberalism and political theology with a kind of tribute to Levinas, because I think the Levinasian way that we deal with ethics is, in many ways, if we can make it more programmatic or institutionalize it, we can politicize it in a real, genuine sense, and that is the answer.
I want to come back to Kieran's point and then this point about ideology that's showing up just as a quick point of clarification here. So I understand the discussion of ideology as already within a kind of Marxian tradition, and particularly like the famous Althusser essay, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. And what Althusser does is he subordinates the religious realm to ideology itself. And I would rather kind of invert that and say that what political theology is ideology par excellence. And so what I like, so the problem of Marxianism and those trajectories, the liberatory messianic movements, is that they perpetuate a form of Euro-Christian temporality that that pushes towards a kind of utopianism or a futurity or a parousia, and that is part of the problem. The Euro-Christian element is part of the problem, and so when I'm talking about doing political theology, I'm trying to name that Euro-Christian problem and unpack it. If there's a way out, it has to be a way out of Euro-Christianity as a social movement. And that's what, if you are readers of the New Polis, look to Tink Tinker's piece on Euro-Christianity. This is an analytic term that we use, and it's a complete anti approach to kind of the broader discourse that's become quite popular in certain circles of academia of political theology. And it's why we founded the New Polis as a reaction to what was happening on political theology today. It's why I left writing for them.
So we have quite a few questions coming in about drugs, Roger, and Carl. I'm sure you have some experience with this sort of thing, this topic as well. Let's see here. We'll roll back up. I had posed a question about the increase in recent decades of drugs used for medical purposes, and Drake also took interest in this about the use of MDMA. So maybe the two of you could say a little bit about that. I'm not sure if you have access to that question in the chat box there.
Yeah, I can speak quickly to MDMA and what's happening along that process is an extension of the birth of the massive growth of the psychiatry movement, which if you look, so I'm seeing this reference to Hardigson's recent book. There's also an earlier book here. I'm putting Storming Heaven by Jay Stevens. In the intro chapters of this, he talks about basically in the early 1940s, we're talking about, about less than 1,000 psychiatrists in the United States, and by the end of the 1940s, 8,000. And this growing profession of human care both whether it's behaviorist or Freudian talk therapy, this keeps on exploding and exploding. And so what is happening there is they're trying to attempt to they see the sort of normal working class person as being somehow needing of care, as traumatized, whether it's from the war or it's probably reactions to the war, but they need to be normalized into a healthy society, and homosexuality and all this sort of stuff. And so what is happening, although with MDMA, it is coming from a good place in groups like the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. I was in a talk with them last week, not participating, but listening. What they have done is they've used the rhetoric of veterans returning from wars to advance the legalization, the therapeutic legalization of MDMA, and then with the idea that behind that is LSD and psilocybin, and that this will become the new kind of therapeutic culture. So I see this as part of what Foucault might call like the biopoliticization or the domestication of psychedelics into a sort of normalized space of professionalism, of neoliberalism. I don't see it. While I'm totally for the end of all drug wars and the deregulation and decriminalization of all substances. Let's just be clear about that. That's an awful imposition of the drug war, which is a reaction to 60s stuff. It's state terrorism at the highest level is the drug war. All substances, I don't care about cocaine, heroin, any of it, right? So just be clear about that. But at the same time, what we see is the professionalization, a big divide between the plant-based people and the chemical-based people. Lots of tensions that I can talk about there. And so the impulse and the rhetoric around it is always medicalized. It's always made therapeutic. It's always about care of the self. And that is just a recapitulation of neoliberalism itself.
Let me just quickly add something there. Foucault, his whole theory of the biopolitical, or if you read Security, Territory, and Population, he talks about the development of the pastorate. And the argument that I make in my book, Neoliberalism and Political Theology, is that neoliberalism is essentially the kind of contemporary version, iteration, transformation of the pastorate or the biopolitical in Foucault's sense. And drugs, identity, the proper experience, particularly the proper moral experience, that Wendy Brown talks about with his theory of responsibilism. This is all part of the same thing. And in some ways, we have institutionalized the 60s, and we call it, capitalism. But capitalism is a kind of throwaway term because it can mean everything and nothing.
All right, so Adam, do you want to jump in here? You had some comments earlier, you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really stimulating and super informative. It's just interesting. I loved Sarah and Karen's questions with regard to method, because that's essentially the question I have between Carl and Roger. And I'm most interested in kind of mobilizing aesthetics in a way that can elicit an effective participation in relation with others that generates temporalities otherwise than Euro-Christianity. And I kind of just entered some notes here from Roger's book. And essentially, I try to orient it towards, there's something about perspective, there's something about dialogical situations, there's something about habitus that can possibly afford modalities otherwise than thinking. Because as somebody who's been a part of the sort of liberal higher education at a private institution, reading, writing, thinking, talking, reading, writing, thinking, talking, as a cycle of verbs, if you will, it generated a temporality that was future oriented and not conducive towards the emancipatory project. So Carl and Roger, I wanted to ask you, with regard to, I guess, specifically this notion of like re-enchantment in a post-secular world, what sort of modalities can we enact as scholars, citizen activists, such that we don't reproduce the same Euro-Christian temporality that Carl had warned that happens?
Can I? Yeah, let me address that, because to go back to drugs, I didn't do drugs in the '60s. Mainly in LSD. Everybody else was doing it. The sister of one of my good friends in high school jumped out a window her freshman year at Berkeley, just as LSD was coming on the scene, and killed herself. And I didn't want to fly and die, so to speak. So I stayed away from it. I gradually got myself into pot. Yes, I inhaled fairly early on. Everybody did. Of course, that's not an issue anymore. But for me, transcendence came through my own kind of messianic moment, which was it's a long story. There were. I mean, it's a crazy story. Some of you are familiar with it. I tried to write it as a kind of fictionalized account. That neither worked. I mean, I'm right now I'm working on my own, memoirs, and try to give it more context in terms of my own intellectual development. But I would call it the realization was the '60s of a messianic moment that was based on the Levinasian principle of encountering the face to the other, encountering the face of God, or the face of the holy, whatever terminology you want to use. And I don't want to get into discussion of particularities of Levinas philosophy, except nobody ever heard of Levinas in the '60s. But when I discovered Levinas for the first time in the late '70s, reading Totalitarian Infinity, it was just like mind blowing for me. So it's like that moment of kind of what we might call realized messianism. Not a messianism of future, not a messianism of domination, not a messianism where a la Enlightenment, we have to educate those people, but in a sense, encountering them where they are. This is not an issue of justice, but a justice that is based on this kind of radical ethics, perhaps even spiritualized. I experienced that in the '60s. And we even had we experienced it as the eschaton. There are even three of us, and I will tell you, one is now a retired famous history professor from the University of Missouri. I won't mention his name, but he's very well known. The other guy became a venture capitalist. The three of us published what we saw as this messianic moment on the front page of the Daily Californian, which was the daily, the newspaper of the University of California, Berkeley, on May 18th, 1967, by the Eschaton Society. And it was kind of, it was very '60s. It didn't have all the sensibilities of today, but, it was for us a kind of revelation, and it wasn't a religion. And in some ways it's not only trans ideological, but it destroys all ideologies. That's, I don't think there is a methodology. In some ways the word method comes, I used to make a joke about Methodism on this. The word methods comes from the Latin metahodos, which can be loosely translated as dead end. Descartes inaugurated the modern era, what Scott calls high modernism, with his discourse on method. And in some ways, the whole modernist project, which liberalism is part of, has been, the Methodism started by Descartes, which some of you were in a course that we read Descartes last week. It's called The Theory of the Subject, but that the modernism is an end. The project, it's over. It's done. Even in its more extreme versions, and there's something new and radical emerging right now, and I can only speak to it in terms of the language of alterity, but I won't say anything more about that.
To speak to Adam's questions, so some of the stuff about aesthetics. And the notion of re-enchantment is not always necessarily a good thing for me. reenchantment or enchanted citizens, just to put that out there. It is the way that the citizens see themselves through a kind of Gnosticism by which they've used a psychedelic model to transcend the nation state and to out-moralize the nation state, which is kind of the trajectory towards globalized neoliberalism, right? So it's a descriptive sense. It's not. I'm not using it as a sense of hope so much. And this is why I think that we need to think about aesthetics in the classic sort of Kantian sense. Aesthetics means of the senses, right? And that, but what we see sort of after the 20th century, particularly after folks like Heidegger, and maybe we could throw Levinas's critique in here, but that there is in the return to ontology and the return to like philosophy is all the history of philosophy, that return towards historicizing the moment, that is so much a part of what critical theory does. I think that critical theory, I do still hold I think that it has a usefulness in holding things at bay a little bit. And this is what Marcuse does, as somebody, I think Patrick mentioned earlier, Eros and Civilization. What Marcuse did in Eros and Civilization is he historicized, he put Freud and the unconscious into a historical moment rather than using it as a static transcendent category. And from that, he was able to critique this notion of the death drive versus the life drive or eros, and to say that what happens what Freud misses is that at the adult, that aesthetics and art can do these sorts of things that are supposed to be happening at childhood, and Freud fixates on the Oedipal sort of drama and misses what aesthetics might possibly be able to do. In the same way, he says that he would say that the people who are saying death to the death drive don't really understand what is at stake, and that's where Marcuse separates himself, and Adorno too separates himself from the broader social movements. They do not understand the youth movements. They see them as privileged, as annoying brats, essentially. And what I think is there might be a possibility of recovering it through what Marcuse does call the aesthetic dimension, and of course there are ways to critique that as well, is in the 21st century. I think that a notion of aesthetics is going to have to be one that is beyond that notion of the senses. And we see that happening all the time. And just as a quick example, the recent 2 posts on the New Polis by Andrew Santana Kaplan, where he is pointing to animality and Black lives, right? And this kind of critique that comes from folks like Hortense Spillers, and in Alexander Wahelier's book, Habeas Viscus, although he doesn't mention that book, this way of okay, like the example that he uses from one of the books he's quoting is that, yeah, okay, you liberate the slaves, say you liberate the slaves, but then what happens to the cattle, right? What happens to the cows? And what he's saying is that Black slave life was attached to the animalness of chattel slavery, in the sense that they were treated as animals, and that there's a continuous connection there of being treated as the non-human rather than trying to include them into this Euro-Christian sense of what the human is. So that is a particular way, that's one example of a way of thinking about aesthetics differently than subject object bodies of the European Enlightenment. But it also brings up all sorts of questions around post-humanism, around animal-human distinction, and the ethics of the face. Levinas says he's not sure if a snake has a face. And so that's where I think that we're at in terms of the discussions. I wanted to intersect with Kaplan's really nice pieces in the New Polis the past 2 weeks. If you haven't read them, read them.
I would say one thing about the 60s too, that the 60s was the sexualization or the somatization, if I want to put that, of the Cartesian ego. Remember, Descartes said the body and the mind have nothing to do with each other. The so-called Cartesian dualism, and that's always been an issue, in terms of it. But still, even if you systematicize or sexualize the Cartesian ego, it's still the Cartesian ego. And critical theory has done a marvelous job of, in a sense, enabling the deconstruction of the Cartesian ego throughout these last years of high modernism, in some ways breaking down the logic of high modernism. But still, in the end, as Nietzsche pointed out, what do you end up with? Nothing. In his famous line at the end of the Genealogy of Morals, human beings would rather have the void for meaning than be void of meaning. And in some ways, what you have are the days of rage. This is in some ways the end point of the Cartesian ego, which we are going through right now.
Guess you could say we're living in the last days, which are the days of rage.
Yeah.
We've got a couple more questions. Ron had posed something on the chat. Ron, did you want to ask your question, or if you don't, that's okay. We can also take a look at it, but it was posted at 7:38.
Or 11:38 here.
I think Roger answered that question, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I jumped in as much as I could, but if I didn't answer part of it, feel free to.
I certainly agree with what you said about the recapitulation. I still wonder if there's not if there's not a way to manage, I guess, for lack of a better word, the three vectors of set, setting, and culture.
Yeah.
In such a way that psychedelics could become a tool of spiritual direction. I guess that's the question I'm wrestling with.
Yes, and these are ongoing conversations in the psychedelic community right now. I tend to agree quite a bit with Beatrice Kayubi-Labatch. She's big researcher of ayahuasca especially, but she's big in the movement as well. I'm quite critical of the spiritual moves towards it for various reasons, but I do think that they are useful tools. Nonetheless, what I especially agree with Labatch is that in this sort of medicalized discourse on psychedelics and what we call the psychedelic renaissance, is that there has not been enough attention paid to the role that culture plays in set and setting. So for those of you who don't know, in drug research, set is what you bring to the situation. Setting is the environment that you're in. And then there's the role of culture in the triad that Ron just pointed out. But I think what Labatch, and I agree with her on this point, is like, it's just like this thing, what Carl was talking about, why he didn't do psychedelics in the 60s. There was this scare around suicide. And we know, I posted that article in here for people, we know that psychedelics themselves do not cause suicide, but that, and this doesn't mean that people in the 60s who used psychedelics didn't also commit suicide. There's just not a correlation, but there was a cultural correlation. So if you go into a psychedelic experience and you're thinking like, I'm afraid like that I might commit suicide, that is going to be your cultural set of the culture affecting your set that you bring into the setting, and then it gets inscribed. The same way that if you think that it's going to liberate you, and I've seen people, I've been in ayahuasca sessions where men have felt like a particular German man I'm thinking of you felt like he was liberated from the morality that this kind of liberal post-Nazi culture had put on, and he'd liberated his true Nazi pedophile self, because it's like the structures of morality that he felt liberated from by that the psychedelic experience lifted for him. And so it's not they're tools for all sorts of uses, but they can't be they can't be tools as agents of liberal liberation in the sense that we're going to make a more democratic society. Like, I would hate to see like Trump's ego, for example, after an ayahuasca trip in the ayahuasca glow. It's bad news if you ask me.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, just one other comment too. This is I'm not a scholar of psychedelics, but actually I did do a lot of research back in the 70s and 80s on altered states of consciousness, and actually experiment a lot with hypnosis back in the early 80s and so forth. There were a number of studies that were done in the 70s that basically showed that people had, quote, religious experiences, when they were on LSD or psychedelics, mushrooms, whatever it was. Those are the two main ones. Then would have visions or would have experience, they'd later report, that were essentially, kind of manifestations of their own kind of, upbringing, cultural presuppositions, and so forth. In other words, that basically culture, your own cultural background, even your own cultural epistemology, was all determinative of what you would experience there. But at the same time, you would experience it in a way that you'd never experienced it before, and that was very often what was called liberating. I don't think there was a lot of fear about people committing suicide. I think it was things accidentally happening. I mean, that was my fear. I wasn't afraid of committing suicide. I was afraid I might jump off a building, which this girl had done. And she actually did it because she told her friends she could fly. And, there's actually other experience. There are other cases of that. So it wasn't totally unique, but it was, it wasn't a controlled circumstance. And people didn't know what it was all about. I had an experience with a woman I was involved in who did do LSD, and basically she went totally nuts, totally nuts, in ways that didn't really disturb me. It actually fascinated me. But then I ended up, finding my first wife and getting married, and she was a real rationalist and scientific, and she just thought, you could be a hippie without doing LSD. So I was calmer toward it by then, but so you don't want to do LSD, I won't do LSD.
I might just threw in a link to the Consciousness podcast, and he's done several different episodes related to psychedelics. So I just linked to the first one with Raphael Millier. There's two parts to that one. It's a little hard to hear, but it's a good, if you're interested in psychedelics and consciousness and kind of up-to-date kind of research on that from a really interesting source, that's just a way in to that discussion. And I don't, this is the problem. What Carl's talking about, this woman that he knew, like how it's the framing of the setting, like some people should probably not be doing psychedelics. They just, like the disposition of people that you wouldn't want to do that. And that's a complicated discussion.
Kieran has a quick comment she wanted to drop.
Yeah.
This needs to be the last too.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I'll be sure. I'll do the shameless thing where I'm not really asking a question. I'm just making a comment. So there we go. But I really appreciated both talks from Carl and Roger. I think this Zizek'ian sense that the best ideology is the one that thinks it's transcended ideology, that thinks that it's beyond it somehow. That's ideology par excellence, I suppose. That's kind of floating in my head right now. And what I really like what Carl and Roger are doing is they're kind of naming the political theology, kind of the cultural and society, like the cultural background to what's to neoliberalism, right? And not just the economic one, which was so it's been so talked about in the past. And so I think this kind of naming what our time is and kind of the religious, the cultural, the ideological setting of just the zeitgeist, I think is really helpful. I think what's disturbing to me is kind of in the way that we frame our questions about this. You know, in the U.S. especially, there's this apocalypticism, like this very end of the world, and it exists where we are over here too. But I think in the States, you just got it at another level this year. But I think it's interesting when we kind of approach our own sense of apocalypticism, the questions and the methods of neoliberalism kind of recode themselves on us. Like, how do we escape? How do we react? How do we escape the ideology into the pure utopian state of being? Like, these are kind of the energy of our questions right now. And I think that's maybe the disturbing thing. And so I find it really helpful what Roger and Carl are doing is just to name what we're doing and name how we think and name where that's coming from since the 60s. So thank you. Yeah.
Great.
Well, that's an excellent comment, and I'm sure Carl and Roger could probably riff on that for at least a half hour. But I think it's also a good point to end the apocalyptic note here. We are at the end of time. It is perhaps the beginning of the end times. But let's thank Roger and Carl one more time.
Thank you all very much for being here.
Great, and please join us for these. We're going to do this once a month. I don't know if you, Sarah, are you still on for next month or not?
Yeah, I was just having a conversation with Roger. I think yes. So
okay, we need to talk about that. But yes, so Sarah Pessin, you see right here, will be one of the focuses of the next one. So please join us for future ones. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.